Thank you for joining today for DirectWomen's webinar, VC and PE Boards, Are They Right for You? My name is Yesenia Chavarria, and I will be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Administrative and Event Specialist here at DirectWomen, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen now and hear my voice. Attendees, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. Please submit questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom console, not the raise hand or chat features. Feel free to submit questions anytime throughout today's program. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of content, followed by a few minutes of Q&A. Links to our speakers' biographies will be provided in the chat once the program has begun. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no longer than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that said, I will turn it over to the moderator of today's program, Steve Haas. Steve?
Thank you, Yesenia. I appreciate that. And thank you to everybody for joining us today. As I said, my name is Steve Haas. I'm a partner in the corporate practice at Hutton. I'm also a board member of DirectWomen. I'm very excited to be here for this program. Real quickly about DirectWomen. For 19 years now, DirectWomen has focused on fulfilling our mission to increase the representation of women lawyers on corporate boards. And we've been very successful at that. And through our programming, DirectWomen tries to create a pipeline of legal leaders who can effectively serve in corporate boardrooms. And we're also proud to serve as a resource for companies who are seeking qualified board candidates. So with that said, as you all know, today's program is VC and PE boards. Are they right for you? And I don't know if we're going to get to a yes or no answer today, but I think it's a really interesting topic because it's not one that you hear a lot of people talk about. And it's a really interesting opportunity for some people in certain fields. So we've got some great panelists here to talk about this. And as Yesenia mentioned, feel free to put questions in through the chat. I'll try to monitor it. We may answer those as we go. We may defer to the end. But if you have questions, feel free to put them through. But let me introduce our panelists here. Very pleased to have Anurma Gupta, Lisa Edwards, Kate Thompson, and Malin Yen with me today. Anurma is the Strategic Legal Advisor and former Senior Vice President and Chief Legal Officer of Unity. She's also an advisory board member of an early stage company. Anurma is a 2016 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute. We have Lisa Edwards, who is the former Executive Chair, President, and COO of Diligent. And she currently serves on the board of Colgate-Palmolive, Logic Monitor, Qualtrics, and Zedata. So I'm impressed that she found time to join us today. Malin is the Managing Director, Founder, and CEO of Operator Collective. If you're not familiar with Operator Collective, I encourage you to go look at the website. It's a really interesting organization. She currently serves on the board of Everpure. And like Anurma, she is also a 2016 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute. And then finally, we have Kate Thompson. Kate is a partner in the financial sponsors practice at Joel Frank, which is the go-to PR firm for many corporations, private equity firms, VC firms, and directors and officers, and probably not a stranger to most of our attendees. All right. So, Kate and I here are mere advisors in this world. So what I thought we might do is I think everyone in the audience would really enjoy hearing about Lisa, Malin, and Irma's backgrounds and, why we've asked them to join the panel. So maybe I'll first start with Lisa, then we'll go to Malin, and then Irma.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining. Thrilled to be here with this group. I think my board journey started probably over 10 years ago. I had identified that being on a board was an objective for me as sort of a next career step. At the time, I was very senior at Salesforce and wanted to sort of make sure that I was continuing to learn and add things to the portfolio. So Really, I gave myself 3 years to get a public board. So I did not look at it and say I'm going to sort of take on this project, and next year I'm going to join a board. I identified it as more of a long-term thing, but and I'm happy to get into more depth about how that first board came about. But so the first board was Colgate-Palmolive, which is obviously a Fortune 500 publicly traded board that you all know and love. Hopefully, everybody uses the toothpaste. But from there, once I started winding down my operating career, I started adding more capacity. And so I took on more board seats. So my 3 private boards, there actually can be a little bit more work sometimes. I think there are people who will tell you private boards are half the work, half the time. I think that really depends on the board and on the person and how you choose to engage, because you can ramp up pretty significantly. But I took on Logic Monitor first, which is a Vista-backed board, and I was recruited into Qualtrics, which had been a publicly traded company, so has sort of quasi-public feel to it. And then on the micro side, my former boss at Salesforce was the co-CEO, Keith Block, who I call the other CEO. And Keith recruited me to one of the portfolio companies in his fund, and that's the Zadita board. So that's sort of the portfolio. I also do a little bit of teaching and a little bit of advisory. So I stay busy, but not nearly as busy as during the operating career.
Malin?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, amazing career that you had. It's cool to learn from you. So I was a former lawyer, and I think I've done every single part of law. I was boutique law. I was outside counsel for a big law. I was in-house counsel. I was deputy general counsel. I was general counsel of a startup. I was part of the founding team of a venture-backed startup that we ended up taking public. And also I'm an alumni of DirectWomen. So I come from it from a little bit of a different angle. But what's interesting is lots of times when you are a lawyer and you do hear from others that, look, it is a little bit harder, right? It's not like most lawyers have not run a P&L, and that is where you want a lot of experience. And sometimes you hear we already have a lawyer in the room. We have our general counsel. We have our outside counsel, et cetera. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my background, and then I think later Steve will talk to us about kind of paths and positioning and things like that too. But what happened is I had left the practice of law. I was at RPX, which many of you guys may have heard of. It was a venture-backed company that we took public and then private again. And I was not initially on the board of that. But while I was there, and so I was part of DirectWomen. Actually, I think I might have been at Cisco at the time. In any event, what happened was, as part of the application process for DirectWomen, they make you do all kinds of things. Some things that I really didn't want to do, which is, right, I think they still make you have 2 or 3 recommendations from CEOs, because they said, look, you need to start telling people you want to be on a board. And so when I did that, one of the CEOs I talked to was Charlie Giancarlo, who I'd known from Cisco, and he was the CEO of a company at the time. Anyway, the thing is it pays off, because 10 years later, when he was looking for, and that started a conversation with him. And then 10 years later, when he was looking to add a board member to what was Pure Storage and now is Everpure, a public company that he's the CEO of, he reached out to me. And so that was my sort of first external board that was unaffiliated, because I was on the board of RPX, which was the venture-backed startup that we took public, but that was something that I was a part of starting. And then also I'm on the board of a private company called Data Grail, which is data privacy compliance. And it's one where I'm an investor, so that's also a different path. But so I guess my learning here was, even though I really did not want to reach out to all these CEOs and tell them I wanted to be on the board, it absolutely 100% works.
I like that you said you're a former lawyer, and too many people say recovering lawyer. So thank you for that too.
The only reason is I finally, because of MCLE, decided to go inactive, but I still am thinking I want to go active again, because I actually still hang out with a lot of lawyers.
Thanks. And Irma?
So I've got a somewhat similar background to Mel, and although our paths have diverged a bit, I've served on nonprofit and advisory boards, and a lot of my perspective comes from spending much of my career as a chief legal officer and in boardrooms of both venture-backed and private equity-backed, as well as public technology companies. I've worked with boards through hypergrowth, financings, international expansion, acquisitions, cyber events, governance challenges, and for better or worse, leadership transitions, which are fun to navigate. So I've had a front row seat to how boards operate, and I am delighted to be here with my co-panelists.
Great. Well, I think my first question now is how common is it to have outside directors on private equity or venture capital backed companies? And when I think about the universe of these companies, we probably put them in two buckets. One, preparing for an IPO, and the other bucket being ones that are not preparing for an IPO. It's not in the horizon. So how common are these positions? And, Lisa, maybe I'll ask you to talk about the non-IPO track, because I think the IPO track is a little bit different when companies start prepping.
Yeah, I agree. The IPO track is obvious because there are certain roles on the board that require an independent. So, it's a tell when a private board starts recruiting a head of NomGov. I think for the company that is not not in a place where they're looking to go public anytime soon, there can be a couple of reasons for it. So it might be that as a part of a negotiation with a financing round, the CEO negotiates that they want an independent director on the board. And that might be that they want someone who is not affiliated with the primary shareholder, which would be the private equity firm, that can act as counsel to them a little bit. And I think those are interesting. I serve that a little bit on one of my PE boards, and those are interesting because it puts the director sort of in a unique place where it's sort of independent, but also as a director, your fiduciary responsibility has not changed. Your fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders, and the shareholders are the people across the table from you, actually. So I think it can be, a place where you give your expertise, you act as a sounding board to the CEO. So that's sort of one scenario where the CEO sort of brings you in because they either want the expertise or they want the sounding board. And the expertise, I sort of would say, is sort of the second category. And that is, if you have domain expertise in a specific thing that a company is facing, it can be a really nice way for them to have a resource that is on call effectively. You can think of it as they're getting your time for free, and hopefully it's not for free. Hopefully there's some compensation involved in the form of equity or cash comp or other. But it is a way for companies to go deep on an area of expertise and tap into cyber expertise, or in the case of many people in the room, legal expertise in a specific domain. There's a lot of data privacy things going on right now, for example. So it might behoove a board that's trying to do something in that space to have someone that's a little bit more of a casual, I can ask the crazy questions to, and sort of formulate a strategy around some of these things. So those are sort of kind of two of the primary reasons. And then the third is that category where they're looking to go public, sometime probably in the next year. And then you would have to add audit, comp, and nom and gov independence to be able to comply with the SEC's regulatory requirements.
Outside the IPO group, I mean, is it a pretty small minority of PE and VC backed companies that have outside directors?
I think it is. they don't really need it. They like to move fast, particularly, the meetings can be more informal. My public company boards are scheduled out through the end of 2028 right now. So I know where I'm going to be in, January of 2028. The private company boards can be a little bit more fungible and a little bit looser. And I think everyone likes to keep it that way. So you don't necessarily want to have, okay, there's 10 people who's, scheduling we're all going to manage and get around. And, I think that the reality is, again, in the boardroom, if the private equity firm has, an 80% share of the equity and the rest is sort of dispersed amongst the management team and CEO, you don't necessarily want to be voted down in the boardroom over a decision. So thinking through sort of what those votes look like and what that balance of power looks like in the boardroom, they would want to manage that quite carefully. And they do. It's a negotiating point when you're bringing in a new sponsor, a new financial sponsor. They will, heavily negotiate what gets an observer seat versus what gets a full on board seat because they want to maintain that decision-making capability.
Yep. Malin, I think you said that you had some experience on the IPO path. Maybe you could comment a little bit about onboarding outside directors in advance of an IPO, and maybe when do companies start thinking about doing that?
Yeah, so Operator Collective is a venture fund. So we are primarily early stage, but we also, a number of our companies are now late stage, and we also make a handful of late stage investments that hopefully one day, we'll have a liquidity event. So I would say, I think I agree with Lisa in that the majority of them don't necessarily have outside independence unless you're prepping for something. But there's actually a decent number that do end up bringing an independent in who has sector expertise oftentimes, or it might be an experienced CEO who's 5 steps ahead, 5 stages ahead of that current CEO, or it could be so say there's a finance startup, it may be someone in the finance space, right, who really knows and is part of that ICP. And so I would say of our public company boards or our private company boards, maybe about a quarter will actually bring on an independent, even though the IPO is not imminent. But it's like help us find help us understand this market a little bit more or bring some sort of expertise. And then, and oftentimes also the way to start with some of those, because you are all busy people. We are all busy people. Private company boards can take a lot of time. It depends on the board. And so it's also, you want to make sure you get to know that company, the people, the other people on the board, as well as the CEO, because you're going to be spending a lot of time with them in many years probably. And so sometimes those board positions start as being advisors, and I think can be a win-win on both sides. And then when you're gearing up for IPO, yeah, that is when you absolutely, are then they are looking. And my experience ways of doing that is by working your network in terms of the VCs that but also the bankers can be a good source of that as well.
Yeah.
I would
And
add
Norma,
one thing I forgot, Steve. The other category that I forgot, and Malin just reminded me of it, is sometimes you're asked to do it for your network and your connections. So I think keeping that network up to date it can be really helpful. And then I think you have to decide, is that what I want to use my network for? If I have, five calls I can make to this person, does one of them want to be on behalf of this company? But that is another reason why a company would bring you in for your network, your ability to help them maneuver an enterprise sale or a partnership or an M&A activity, to get them to the right people.
Norma, could you talk maybe a little bit about advisory boards and board observers? Because I think that's sometimes an underlooked path. And for someone trying to build a resume, I think those are really good credentials.
Yeah. So board observers, I tend to think come with investments. It's, the company may not be mature enough to want to bring in an outside director, but the investor wants to keep a closer eye on things. And as part of the investment negotiation, they get a board observer seat. So it's a good way, like if you've not been in a boardroom, it's a good way to get experience for what the dynamics are like, what the governance issues are like, and sort of what the interactions are like. I think advisory boards, also great experience. It's sort of one step removed from the boardroom, tends to be a separate set of meetings, and tends to be more focused on sort of the expertise that the company needs, whether it be technical or industry or market, international perhaps. But those tend to be focused on specific areas where the company wants to get outside advice from a group of people who are well versed on that topic, and want to help the company mature.
This is going to be a jump ball for any and all of you, but let's talk a little bit about what makes service on these boards unique. And some of the factors maybe I hope you will address is what is the ownership of this company? I think there's a big difference between a private equity fund that owns 90%, maybe management owns the rest, versus a VC-backed company that is maybe through several rounds of financing, has a lot of different funds. I think there's big differences between what is the stage of the company, early versus late stage, and maybe also who is on these boards. So I don't care who wants to go first, but have at it.
I don't mind starting. I think it's a good clarification because I think when you say private board, that can mean a lot of different things. So, private equity tends to invest in more mature companies, but that's not true across the board. You will get private equity funds that say we do smaller companies, but they're often buying control, and they often have a playbook that's company wide for how they improve operations, typically how they improve operations, financially, to shore up the balance sheet, to, juice growth a little bit. And they typically have a couple of year time horizon after which they want some kind of exit, whether that is selling into a new fund at their firm, selling into a different private equity fund, selling to a strategic. But they're often on a couple-year cycle. There's a Wall Street Journal article in the last couple of days how there's a giant backlog of these things with the way interest rates have gone. So I'd encourage you to read that if you are interested in that. Venture tends to invest in younger, higher growth companies. Usually it's a minority stake. It's usually funding expansion and growth, and it is much less so talking about, balance sheet and EBITDA. They're really talking about what is your top line growth. You also have growth equity within that sort of Venn diagram, and the growth equity would be same flavor. It is, doing a minority stake. Typically less leverage in that boardroom. They're investing in fast-growing companies, but they tend to be more established, so they may have a minimum revenue hurdle and may be more focused on, prep for IPO or some kind of strategic exit. But they tend to have longer. Venture in general tends to have longer timelines. When you talk to a venture fund, they may think about it in 10-year cycles, whereas a PE firm might think of it as 2 to 5 year cycles. So I think those are a little bit of the some of the differences. The strategy of a PE backed firm is there's often a very strong investment thesis that is really hammered out amongst the firm, and bought in on by the private equity or private equities that are going into that, and so they have a notion of how this is going to go and the strategy that they want to pursue on day one. With a venture firm, particularly with a smaller, both on the revenue side and just a less mature company, that they may be evolving that strategy. They may be saying, we know we have product market fit, but we don't know exactly what we want to do with this. And there are different things that come in with that, with more power in the CEO and a founder-led company, which a lot of these venture-backed companies tend to be. Your risk profile might be different. So on a private equity board, you'll have execution risk, and you'll have the fact that you may have levered up the company and have a debt repayment that you have to do. So there's a cash flow risk. But on the venture-backed firm, you may have the product market fit might not be what we thought, and then you have big key person risk. So you have, if the CEO decides to, exit stage left, or something catastrophic happens, that becomes an existential risk for the company. So and it's a different dynamic in the boardroom with the amount of leverage, particularly some of the deals that you lawyers out there all strike these days with, different classes of company stock, different voting capabilities on the board. You may have a founder who can run the show. And I'd like your money. Thank you very much to the venture firm, but I'm going to tell you how this is all going to go. So the dynamics can be quite different in the boardroom.
Yeah, just agree a lot with what you said, Lisa. I think that last point is one to think about, particularly in venture-backed firms where there is founder control, because that totally changes the dynamic in the boardroom. I've been in situations where the founders have maintained more than 50% control. And in that instance, I think it's harder for board members to kind of exert influence. And you have to think carefully about how do you fulfill your fiduciary obligations as a board member when, you've got founders maintaining control and wanting to do certain things. So definitely something to keep in mind. And the way I think about it is VC-backed firms are focused on value creation, and PE-backed firms are focused on value realization. So when you have that dichotomy, the issues that the board is focused on tend to be different and be driven by those two motivations. And that then influences the issues that you end up discussing as a board, and of influence that you have as a board member.
Hey, what are your thoughts on this? I know when Lisa was talking about having someone walk out the door, existential risk, you were thinking, call me. But as an advisor, you get to see, I think, a lot of dynamics. And you and I don't have the benefit of serving on boards, other than my role here on DirectWomen, but we get to see a lot of boards from the advisor seat, and it gives us interesting perspective.
Absolutely. I think as a helpful framing, the way that we generally get brought in and work with boards tends to be in two buckets. One, either event driven, which could be a crisis, a cybersecurity incident, a leadership change. Um, it could be leading up to a big transaction. That's one on the event driven side. And then the other, half of that would be just regular good governance. So boards bringing us in to do planning around crisis preparedness or cyber preparedness, and, kind of the good hygiene things that you would expect a board to do. In my seat, I work with anywhere from 3 to 4 dozen financial sponsors, ranging from VC firms, growth equity firms, to the large publicly traded diversified alternative asset managers. So within that spectrum, see a lot of different types of boards when interacting around these different types of events. Um, and I would say the most frequent call I get is around a leadership change, as you mentioned, Steve. So it'll be something where generally it's the board that is reaching out, and they're calling and they're saying, hey, we've had some, either it's challenges with performance, disagreements around certain things. We really want to make sure that this transition goes smoothly. How can you help us prepare? We're not ready to tell anybody at the company that this is coming. And we want it to be a very smooth transition. And so that's when we work directly with the board members to really craft the story. Why is this the right time to make a transition? Do they have, the next right leader to come in? Thinking through what are all the kind of downside risks of doing this, and then how do you manage an outgoing CEO who may or may not want to be an outgoing CEO? And I think, what I've seen from my seat is, that every board that I've dealt with, every CEO that I've dealt with takes this type of news differently. And I think there are some common, tenets around what a successful transition looks like, and everybody's goals tend to be let's make this as smooth as possible so employees don't freak out and, we can continue to move forward. But, that's the type of situation that I find, people are really thoughtful about. And sometimes we're dealing just with a board that is, sponsor, from the sponsor. And sometimes we're dealing with a board that has an independent, member who tends, in my experience, to be one of those kind of sector specialists and operator specialists, that's sitting in that seat.
Thanks. I think, what I would emphasize for the audience here is there really is a big difference between the private equity controller versus the venture capital firms versus the founder controller. And I'm not saying any of them are red flags, they're just very different. And especially with the founder, I think that's a particularly unique context because controlling founders usually have big personalities. They're forward thinkers, right? And they're very personally invested in this company beyond the financial stake. And I think that's something that people really have to consider when they're looking at boards and going on, because those three companies are very different from each other.
I have an example there where we had a founder, well-known founder in the space, who brought us in. And if you look at history, this is not an isolate situation. Brought us in, was ready to move on, do something else. We did an entire rollout around a new CEO coming in. I don't think it was 18 months later that founder came back and said, no, I'm coming back. I want to be the CEO. So obviously that message the second time around, a little more tricky. But even once they're out the door, depending on how involved they are in the process, if they stay on the board, there's always that real possibility. And we see this a lot with portfolio companies where they need that validation from the founder, even once the founder is gone. And so how do you maintain a constructive relationship that isn't too friendly that then, when the next bump comes around, everybody says, oh, just bring back in the founder.
Yeah. So I think this is a good segue into maybe I could get Malin and Irma and Lisa to comment on what is board service like? If someone is getting on one of these boards, I know it's really hard to generalize here, but what is the role of the outside director? And I think I probably want to downplay for the audience that it's probably often not the governance role they might be contemplating. It's more of that sector industry experience. But these questions are these boards rubber stamps? These is there a high degree of corporate governance, or is this very informal board operations? And any one of you can take that first. All right, I'll call on Malin.
Yeah, call Malin. I don't want to go first.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, whether it's a public company board, I've been on a public company board or a couple of public company boards, a private, venture-backed board, and also KQED, which is public radio, which is a nonprofit. I would say all of them are run as formal boards. None of them are casual meetings and things like that. There are also some companies where I actually prefer to have a board observer seat and not board seats. I actually strong preference for not having board seats for the private companies. And even those I would say are all run as formal board meetings. So and I think board members take their fiduciary duties very seriously. But one thing is, and I don't think that would be a question with this group, but one thing to recognize as you're coming into a board, especially if you're a new board member, and the board has been together for a while, is why are they bringing you in and what's that expertise? Because it doesn't mean that you only answer questions that have to do with that area of expertise, but you do kind of understand what the dynamic is and why they're wanting you in particular. And of course, you should opine on everything, but it takes a fair amount of prep, right? You want to obviously make sure that you're prepped. Sometimes these board decks are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, and people have tried all kinds of things like turning it into a podcast using Notebook LM. At the end, you still have to just read it all because while it's, while those things can be fun or helpful, they're also kind of funny. It's like, and they had their best quarter ever, right? So, it's the ones that I'm on are they're all quite formally done, right? And I think that is important, but really just understanding what the mix of people is. And then like Everpure is a complicated business, right? It's very complicated. So also just figuring out how you can get up to speed, especially when you're a new board member, to learn a new business, and can be key, because obviously if you're getting brought in for something that where you're already a subject matter expert, then you already have that. But for me, I was not a storage expert, and now with storage and AI, there's a whole level of understanding. Now it's marrying more of my backgrounds together, but storage itself was not an area I had background in.
Norma
Yeah,
or Lisa?
I would just say, to follow on to Melon's point about sort of coming up to speed in an industry, that can be part of the fun and that can be part of the direction. That is why I took the board seat at Zadita, because I feel like Edge is, sort of a really important new area. It's sort of all of these endpoints, and how do you manage that in a AI world, and this proliferation of cameras and devices and monitoring and all that kind of stuff. So I had a personal, desire to really get closer to that technology, and it was one of the things that drove my taking that board seat. So it can be a very good symbiotic relationship where, if you have a desire to learn a new industry and stay close and tight to something. It's also why I do my 2 advisory boards in AI, because I want to, kind of keep my finger on the pulse of, some of the new things that are going on in AI, but I don't necessarily want to, sort of take up, I think of myself as having one free public seat that I will eventually fill one day. And I don't necessarily want to take one of those up with that full capacity. So I would say that, I think a lot of the differences we've talked about a little bit. I agree on the formal approach. I would say the private boards that I'm on, have gigantic decks for us to read, just like everyone else. I never put any of those decks into public LLMs, by the way. So I do, and I don't know any board directors who do, just for the security reasons for it, even though it is not necessarily a public company material, non-public information. There's enough private companies out there that the ownership is sensitive about the financials leaking out or whatever, that it's not good practice. So you have to set aside the time to do these, and that sort of goes to, do you have the capacity now, or when will you? And then I would say, from a board posture, and maybe contrasting as well the public company, for the public company, you are there for building sustainable long-term shareholder value. It is oversight, constructively challenging, asking the right questions, and sort of a long-term horizon with boards approving the management strategy, but there's a clear separation between management and oversight. That separation is a little bit less on the private company, particularly the smaller private companies. So I'd also distinguish between one of those companies that's sort of quite large and prepping to go public, like an OpenAI is going to be right now putting in lots of processes and lots of things to kind of get them in shape. But for the PE-backed firm, the board is more active direction, performance management, implementing that playbook that I talked about. There's a concentrated owner. They're looking at a 3 to 5 year exit, and it's extremely metrics oriented. So it's a QBR every board meeting, which can be really helpful for the management team actually to know that they have to. They have metrics that they are shooting for, and they have to report on those metrics on a quarterly basis. And there's a format for doing that. So VC firms also, it starts to feel a little more like a QBR, but a little bit less playbooky. Some venture firms have here's our preferred information that we want to get every quarter. If you have multiple venture firms in there, then figure out how to make all of us happy. Maybe you're blending a couple of different dashboards together to come up with something that makes sense to all of the firms in there. But you still have these milestone, driven things. You've got reasonably concentrated ownership, except you've got that founder and employee thing that we talked about, and the role of the board there, as opposed to the PE firm, which is, sort of, here's the playbook, let's talk about execution, how's your EBITDA. On the venture firm, it's more coaching, problem solving. I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends. My advice to you is don't do that. That kind of thing is happening more on the venture board.
So I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian here. I mean, as a corporate governance lawyer, it warms my heart to hear you all talk about the level of formality. But I will say, in my experience, a lot of these boards operate with much less formality than the public company board, and it's a different role. But it really gets back to the characteristics of the ownership in the board. And if you're talking about a 90% owner that's a private equity fund, that has to have the board meeting. They already know what they want to do. Hopefully you're serving on a board with a private equity fund that respects you and they've got you there and want to hear your voice. But at the end of the day, they usually know what they want to do. And then the real danger for directors on some of these companies is you find yourself in a distressed situation. And I do sometimes think that, it seems to be fashionable for people to give Delaware a hard time these days. But at the end of the day, try to come up with an instance where a Delaware court has held an outside director personally liable. It doesn't happen. And while the frequency of litigation, private companies is pretty low, you can find yourself in an interesting situation with conflicts of interest. Kate, I want to ask you one final question on this topic, and then I want to get to how do we get on these boards. But maybe for Kate, are there reputational factors that directors should be considering when they're thinking about these various boards?
The short answer is yes. And I guess, as you think through kind of, potential litigation risk and other things from upholding your fiduciary duty, I will also say, a very common thing that I see from where I sit is, social activists, whether that's somebody that doesn't believe that the portfolio, that the company should be having certain kinds of eggs in their supply chain, or that they want to be unionized. A very common tactic for some of these social activists is when they're not getting traction by going out to the company, is they start to go after the board members. And sometimes in my advice is always to be, ignore it to the extent that you can, because as soon as you start capitulating, as the board member, you become the weak link. And any other place where you might have associations, somebody that's trying to put pressure on a certain company is going to come back to the place that was successful last time. That seems to be, how these social activist campaigns work. They're going to put out a press release. It's going to be pretty clear, then they've got their playbook of how things happen. So, in that, I think that there is some reputational risk in that, you got to be prepared for, kind of attaching yourself to a certain company and feel really good that this, as you would when you're evaluating any sort of opportunity. Do I believe in this company? Do I believe in the leadership? Do I believe in the sponsor? Because you're going to be very much, kind of in it with them. And sometimes things look great and rosy, but Steve, to your earlier point, and often when I'm brought in is when things go south. And that could look in a lot of different ways, whether that's a restructuring or, in some cases it could be fraud or, other certain things that may come up. And I think there is, there's an ability to separate yourself from the company to some extent, but in today's environment, it only takes one click to see the association, and that can carry with you for a long time.
Thanks, Kate. All right, so let's shift then. How does one get on a VC or PE backed board? Lisa, you want to start, and then we'll go to Anurma and then Malin for their thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think Malin touched on it a little bit, but maybe I'll expand on her thoughts earlier as it relates to, sort of reaching, being overt and reaching out and telling people that this is an interest for you. And that is, effectively what I did. I tell people that I treated it like dating, where, I told everyone I know, if you know anyone, set me up. And I think particularly for people in, in public companies, it can be very, very helpful to reach out to your CEO. And that's really two reasons. One is you want to make sure this person is supportive of this journey. Because if you go all the way down the road with a firm, and this actually happened to me before it, I ultimately got approved to take a board seat at Salesforce. The first time I did it, kind of thought it was a no-brainer, and then I was told no. So you don't want to put yourself in that position where there everything is sort of ticked and tied except the like, okay, we got to get a press release ready, and then you're actually not allowed to do it. So that's one reason to go to your CEO. But the more subtle reason is they get approached a lot, and they can't actually take all these seats. They sometimes may have permission or bandwidth to take one, and I highly recommend that like they do that just so they have that view of the world. But they can't really take more than one and sit in a CEO role in a large company and play that operating role. So they get the calls, and your ask to them can be. If it is something that you can't do or won't do or not interested in, I would love the opportunity to speak to them. And the other thing I always tell people is take every single call for a board. Once you start putting this out there into the universe and say, I'm going to manifest this, take all the calls. So if someone calls you and they say, I have a board seat on Chevron, and you say, oh, but I'm not interested in oil and gas, take the call. Because first of all, sometimes on those calls you learn, hey, there's a strategic direction that I can get behind, or there's something that if I feel passionately about it, I can influence it from the inside. And that may be something that you come around to. If not, you can at least have a couple of introductory conversations with people and start to expand your network and the people that you know. And at the right time, and I wouldn't let it go too late because you're wasting everyone's time if you do, but at the right time, you can say, this isn't the one for me. However, I'd love to be kept, in the loop. The other thing that you can do, and I did pretty consistently when I was doing this, I wasn't getting a lot of board seats because there's a chicken and egg to this. The weird thing about having, particularly on a public board, the weird thing about it is the first question you get asked when you get interviewed for a public board is, what other boards are you on? And you have to say, well, I'm not on any other boards. And, it's sort of the act of getting a board all of a sudden makes you qualified. So the day that I accepted and got the press release out on Colgate-Palmolive, I got calls from 3 different headhunters saying, can you take another board seat? And I said, I was actually qualified yesterday. And, you guys didn't call me, but like, no, actually I can't. I can only take one while I'm sitting in an operating seat. So I think it's that's a really interesting phenomenon that happens, but there's certainly that chicken and egg aspect to it. So when I would get the calls for just regular old headhunting roles, like trying to recruit me away to, company XYZ, I would say, listen, I'm super happy where I am. I appreciate the call. What I am interested in from a career perspective is looking into board seats. Can you put me in touch with the people at Heidrick, Spencer Stewart, Korn Ferry, that handle your board practice? And they all have board practices, and they're all happy to do it because it's a colleague, and it's not a colleague that they're kind of competing for talent for in any way. So that is another kind of way to do it. And then I think on the private boards, it's really continuing to work your network. So I would say I am a at work performative extrovert. At home, I recover by being by myself and reading books. So I'm a closet introvert. But when I said I want to get on some board seats, I made myself go to networking events. I made myself follow up with people. I made myself go have coffee with people who I'd met along the way and said, hey, I'd be happy to, give you some advice. So I think that's, just another thing that you need to do is, really kind of work the network and put it out there into the universe that it's something you're interested in.
Norma?
Networking makes the world go round, whether you're looking for an operating role, a board seat, or other types of opportunities. It really is the networking. And I think, for board seats, there's a variety of types of people to target, whether it be VC firms, PE firms, sitting board members, CEOs that you know, not necessarily the ones you've worked for, although those are the best ones. Other executives, as Lisa said, when you're in an operating role, you can only take most likely one public company. But since they're on a public company, they may be hearing about other opportunities that they can't take right now. So don't discount letting other executives know that you're interested. I think search firms are useful. It's always great to make contacts. I think if you're looking for your first board seat, search firms may be less effective because they tend to target the ones who are already sitting because it's an easy win for them. But hit your network as broadly as possible.
Malin, anything to add before I open this up for Q&A?
Uh, I mean, yes, it's relationships, right? At the end of the day, it's relationships. It's hard to, and while it can happen, just getting something cold can be tough. And the other thing is, what's I think really unique right now in time with respect to legal. Legal has always seen everything across the entire company, but even more so now in the time of AI, like legal can really be a leader here and also be a driver in things like AI transformation and productivity and how you're running your department. So there's a few different ways. There's one, yes, you're a legal expert, but second, you are a business leader of a, in many cases, a public company or a large company. And so you are also a sector expert of that sector. So thinking of yourself not as a lawyer, but as a business, C-suite executive of a networking company, a storage company, or whatever. So that is what people view you as opposed to for your skill set. And then on what Anurma said is, and Lisa said, which is like, I only take one public company board. That's all I'll do at a time. I have a full-time, I have more than a full-time job running my own fund, but I do get approached by them, and a number of my friends get approached. A lot of them will only take one board seat at a time or two board seats at a time. And so they like to have lists of people that they can turn to say, I'm not available to do this, but here's 5 people. And the fact is, out of sight, out of mind, right? If you haven't talked to that person, if they're not aware that you're looking at a board, looking for board position, they might not think of you. So letting it be known and overcoming your introversion, which at least I share that as well. It works because otherwise people will not think of you.
I'm so glad you mentioned AI. I do think that's going to create opportunities for lawyers to go on the board, whether it's AI governance, AI implementation. It's a common theme we hear of lawyers, both male and female, trying to get on boards. Is, well, I'm just viewed as a lawyer. And as someone that maybe as Lisa said earlier, or Nirma, that, well, we already have a lawyer, right? We have our general counsel. But areas like privacy and data security have been creating a lot of opportunities for lawyers, and I think AI will as well. In our last few minutes, let me go to some Q&A. We've got a couple comments from the audience. One question for Malin directly. Can you share some factors you might consider when deciding whether you'd prefer to be a director versus a board observer in a private company?
So I actually just prefer to be a board observer, period. And the reason is that I feel like in some ways, I feel like I have a closer relationship with the CEO and a more real relationship. I mean, a more raw relationship. And our job, Operator Collective, is a venture fund that's focused on, we have foundations, endowments, and universities on board, but we also have operators, right, who are investors in the fund. And so when they come to us with a problem, like, we can help because of all the operating expertise. I don't want them to feel like they need to put a shiny spin on things, because sometimes as a board member, it is, you're, especially if it's one of your lead investors, because even though you need to share with them all the problems and things that you're having as a CEO, you're also thinking, well, gosh, I need to see whether or not they're going to lead the next round or something like that. And so it's the nature of our firm too, because we tend to not lead investments. If you lead investments, you do have to take a board seat. But for us, I'd prefer to have so that we're the first ones they call when they have an issue, when they have a strategy thing, even probably before they call their board members. And so also it's a capacity thing for us. is you see some of these venture funds who these partners are on like 15 boards. I don't know how they do that and also pay attention, right, Lisa? Like the
Yeah.
amount of time and attention. And so you see them sometimes at these board meetings where they just be like, oh, your LTV to CAC changed. You need to make sure that's better. You're like, great. Like this, if I were the CEO, I'd be like, that's not helpful. Like, I know it changed. And so, and not saying that everyone's like this, but you just certainly don't have the time because that VC's job is also to go out and find new investments as well. And so for us, we like to take board observer seats because sometimes I'll go to the CEO and say, I don't think you need me anymore. Right? You're at a stage where you're on your way. You should replace me, or I can put an operator in this seat as a board observer. It's a lot easier to do that as a board observer than it is as a board member. Or sometimes, now it's time for an independent because I feel no desire to stay on a board any longer than I feel like I can add value because why? Right.
Another good question here. What are your thoughts on professional director designations such as NACD directorship certification? Does that meaningfully improve someone's chances of getting on a board?
I mean, it doesn't hurt, but that's not going to be a driving factor of somebody getting on a board. It's really about sort of what are the skills that the board needs at that moment in time, and what can you add to the board. And you'll never get picked for a certification.
Agree. I think it can be helpful in helping you understand the work of the board, helping you understand maybe what you're getting yourself into, as well as, some of the basics around duty of loyalty, duty of care, et cetera. But um, I don't have an issue with the one that mentioned in the chat because I think it's more of an educational series. I do have an issue with the ones that sort of it feels a little bit like, okay, come to our thing and then you're going to get a board seat, because I think most of the time that doesn't happen.
I mean, that's an important point, Lisa. Education is good, particularly if you've not been inside the boardroom. So understanding what board interactions are like and the issues that boards deal with is always a good thing.
Another audience question. Can you talk a little bit more about the time commitment on board service and if you're willing, what compensation might look like at these companies?
I can a little bit. Like a lot of these answers, the answer is it depends. And it depends both on your capacity. Like I would say I spend a lot more time on my boards now that I'm not in an operating role. And when I was in an operating role, maybe what I brought to the table was slightly different because it was fresher. Like I had a comp point of here's what I'm seeing in this other job. But the reality is I just have more bandwidth to spend on some of this stuff. But I would say it can be as much as you want. So it can be I want to go to the sales kickoff and really sort of wander around and help people, like really make sure I'm absorbing the company message. Or it can be as light as I'm going to show up to the board meetings and really try to contribute in those board meetings. And I'm going to make sure I do my homework and read the docs. And that can take, 10, 20 hours before the board meeting. But, and it's literally that range of things. It can be, you can treat it almost like a part-time job. And it also depends on the CEO, I think, and on the other investors. So if the other investors, maybe you have a CEO transition going on and you're on the interview panel. So you are, once a week for multiple hours interviewing new CEO candidates and reading up on their background and, looking at the materials that have been prepared on pros and cons and that kind of thing. These things can ramp up. And that's another reason to think about what your capacity is. How many seats can you really take while you're in an operating role? And afterward, I mean, I have a lot of spare capacity right now, but also if all of my boards had a crisis at the same time, I'd be pretty busy. I talked to a director last year on public company who I think she said they had over 100 meetings. They were in a little bit of a crisis, but it can happen. And so, that's another thing that you have to sort of filter in as you think about the time commitment is it can expand pretty greatly if there's something going on. There's a cybersecurity incident or a product recall or a CEO incident. All those things can start to to wildly expand the time commitment if you're not prepared for it. I also want to give one quick plug back to Kate because that's when you call her company. They're fantastic at that.
Absolutely.
All right, well, one final question here because we're at the end of our hour, but I did get a final question from someone who says they receive a large number of unsolicited messages on LinkedIn regarding advisory roles on startups. Do you have any suggestions for trying to figure out whether those are legitimate? I'd say don't give them your social security number.
Good
I
advice.
mean, do your homework, look into the company. It's probably, I mean, I would say you want it to come from a source that you know or a friend of a friend, rather than blind reach outs on LinkedIn. And you also need to make sure that it's not in conflict with your day job. So a lot of times the advisor firms or the research firms, they just want kind of insider information that you should not be in a position to be doling out.
Okay. Well, thank you all.